You are saying something very, very interesting. You are saying that even powerful Prime Minister like Narendra Modi would find it sometime that, the bureaucracy doesn't fall in line completely.
No, I've seen it from within, actually. A lot of the things, not everything that a Prime Minister wants done actually happens, but it works very slowly. The way to say, the way to do it is, you say, sir, yes, we are doing it. The book simply is describing what led to this thinking on the part of Nehru. It's only one person who gives a very trenchant critique of it, and that's Milton Friedman. Labor was completely excluded from that development model. Agriculture actually gets neglected more or less fully. And we don't see the serious effort to revive agriculture until Lal Bahadur Shastri comes in. So you got into these two extremes where capital was without labor and labor was without capital.
You need to make steel, you need to have power plants, you need power generators.
The book doesn't argue with that.
Even after 3 decades of liberalization, the poverty hasn't completely vanished. So isn't this 3 decades enough? Hello and welcome to the Federal. I have with me today a very special guest, Dr. Arvind Panagariya, Chairman of the 16th Finance Commission and Professor at Columbia University. In his latest book, The Nehru Development Model, Dr. Panagariya discusses how even after 60 years of Nehru's death, his ideas on economic development still continues to occupy the mind space of policymakers in India. He believes that while Nehru's political project, which consisted of democratic constitution and universal suffrage, was a phenomenal success, his economic project that was built on heavy industry and rapidly expanding public sector was a massive failure. These policies, he says, led to India's isolation from the world markets. However, in the last 3 decades, he says, India has turned from an inward-looking and control-ridden economy to outward-oriented market economy. To discuss this and more from his book, The Nehru Development Model, I'm joined by Dr. Panagariya. Welcome to the Federal, Dr. Panagariya. Here is your book. I'm displaying you. Let's start discussing this.
Thank you, Srini. Really glad to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Panagariya, the core of your argument against Nehruvian model is its over-dependence on heavy industry. You say that even import substitution industrialization would not have been the starting point of industrialization. At that point in time, almost everyone was convinced of Nehru's approach. You have quoted American economist Milton Friedman, who strongly critiqued Nehru's model, and though he was finding it difficult to, he himself was finding difficult to gain wide acceptance in his own country. Mahatma Gandhi, who had a powerful voice too, couldn't convince anyone on his village-based decentralized model. So did Nehruvian model therefore become a fait accompli?
It's more or less was so, I would say, because, anybody who was influential within India, whether you talk of the politicians or of the intellectuals, any other, even the businessmen, they were all on board. In fact, the leading businessmen had produced what is now known as the Bombay Plan as early as 1944 and 1945. And if you look at that plan, and the second 5-year plan, which was Nehru's foundational plan, you would see more or less the same spirit behind them. Both endorse heavy industry, both endorse a major role for the public sector, both endorse the objective of self-sufficiency. So even the businessmen who you would think potentially would be the opponents of that model were actually on board.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I'll come to that later. I think you have even quoted Tata on this.
Yes.
So the question I really would ask you here is, I would like to draw your attention to Nobel laureate Amartya Sen's choice of technique. In your book, you actually referred 2 choices, but I'm referring to his choice. he says perhaps he has concluded that capital intensive ultimately any industry started with capital intensive ultimately leads to higher growth path as opposed to allowing traditional industry to grow over a period of time with value addition. So would you disagree with him? You have actually said India opted for plan 2, what you have referred in your book, whereas probably you prescribed plan 1.
Right. No, I mean, now the time has proven actually that the model based on capital intensive industries first, meaning here heavy industry first, turned out to be the Achilles heel of the Nehru plan. Because we could not become competitive in that, nor was that model inclusive. You see, the model itself was very exclusionary in the sense that it hardly employed any workers in the industry. And if you don't employ workers, you don't improve the skill base, you do not spread growth, you are not taking advantage of your most abundant factor. I mean, at that time, our most abundant factor, and still to some degree, is labor. But labor was completely excluded from the development model because heavy industries, steel mills, machinery factories, they could hardly employ much by way of workers.
Yeah, but in the first plan, they did try to give a lot of more emphasis to agriculture, didn't they? Then, of course, in the second plan, which you also said, the foundational plan, things changed.
Yes. No, I think first plan, you see, was not a well thought out. It did not carry the stamp of Nehru's own thinking, because by the time they approved, the first plan, 2 years had already passed. So even Nehru says there in his speech when the plan was discussed in the parliament that, this is effectively only a 3-year plan. And what they did was whatever projects were underway at the time, they were pulled together under a single document, and mostly it represented that collection of the projects that were underway or new ones that they were about to start. In that plan, you're absolutely right that expenditure on agriculture was significantly larger. But that was only because,
nearly, I think 40% or so, 43% or so. Yeah.
Right. But that was purely by default. Nehru did defend it and sort of said that we need agriculture, etc. But if you then see what happens in the second plan and subsequently, agriculture actually gets neglected more or less fully. And we don't see the serious effort to revive agriculture until Lal Bahadur Shastri comes in.
So I'll refer back to what Amartya Sen said. Are you, if I understood you correctly, you're trying to say that, look, this is a proven model, what Sen is saying, but at that point of time, it didn't work. Is that what you're trying to say?
No. See, it's not a question of at that time. The question here is that initially, when you are starting your development process, you have very meager capital. And if you put all that capital into 3 steel mills and perhaps maybe 1 or 2 machinery factories, then in effect you are creating a situation in which capital is working with no labor, and labor which was left in the cottage and small industry and village industry had no capital to work with. So you got into these 2 extremes where capital was without labor and labor was without capital. The proper allocation of capital and labor at the time was to somewhere in the middle, as Milton Friedman rightly pointed out. So any model any development process which begins with capital intensive industry has almost, now retrospectively at least, almost no chance of success.
But those days, there was hardly any steel mills. I mean, India badly required steel mills. There was hardly any electricity. Nobody was making power. See, of course, now a lot of steel companies have cropped up. So he did allow the growth of Tata Steel. He he had to make some of these, which is in private sector, which was actually in private. I'll come to that later when you have referred to socialism. But all these things were required. You need to make steel. You need to have power plants. So you need power generators. You need electricity. All those things are also required at that point of time, isn't it?
Now, if you take the view that I want to be self-sufficient, and therefore I'm not going to import steel, I'm not going to import machinery, I'm not going to import power plants or power machinery, then you're right. And that was the way Nehru actually argued his case. And he was upfront on it. He said that, we got to achieve self-sufficiency. I do not want to rely on international trade, because it is international trade which is at the root of imperialism. And with that, so he was internally consistent. I do not argue with that. The book doesn't argue with that. Then once you accept that self-sufficiency is the goal, then automatically you need machinery industry, and you need steel and whatnot. Anything that will require investment requires machinery, and so you have to do that. So one could step back a bit, that the whole idea of self-sufficiency was the wrong one. And in any case, he didn't achieve self-sufficiency. Even on steel, he did not achieve self-sufficiency, because steel continued to be imported, because the demand was a lot more than what we could produce domestically with very limited amount of capital.
Yeah, but perhaps he was also living in those times where, he interpreted it as, he saw it as imperialistic attempts if he didn't go for self-sufficiency. But, if we have to come about, we have to think of more modern, market-led growth, or, leaving things to market. But those were the days when you have in the book said even Milton Friedman found it difficult to explain in his own country his ideas. So, but India and the subcontinent was completely swayed by the Soviet experiment. So wasn't it a difficult time for him?
No. I mean, the book doesn't argue with that. The book simply is describing what led to this thinking on the part of Nehru. And the book also goes in great detail explaining that virtually everyone was in agreement with Nehru's model. Mahalanobis, who wrote the draft second five-year plan, which was basically a translation of Nehru's ideas, was a leading intellectual at the time, and he supported. And all our economist friends of the time, leading ones, who had been consulted actively through a panel of economists, which included a total of 21 economists on it, led by C.D. Deshmukh. They all endorsed it, except some a note of dissent by B.R. Shenoy. You could one should also give some credit to Brahmanand and Vakil. Vakil was the senior one of the two, and he was on one of these 21 economists on the panel. And he also brought in then Brahmanand, who was his young pupil at the time. And they suggested something a little different. But by and large, neither B.R. Shenoy nor Vakil and Brahmanand at the time questioned basically the approach based on heavy industry. What Brahmanand and Vakil said, or Vakil and Brahmanand said, was that we ought to have greater focus on agriculture, and in terms of machinery, our focus should be more on the agricultural machinery. But agricultural machinery was also heavy industry after all. So in this sense, I think, all the other constituent, even so, these 20 economists gave a thumbs up. In fact, these 20 economists wanted to go much farther in terms of regulating the economy than the second five-year plan itself was arguing. So if you read the submission that the panel of economists gave, which I quote quite extensively in the book, they're wanting more, not less regulation and more interventions by the government. Politically, most politicians are with it. There is no major disagreement by the chief economists, by the chief ministers of the states who are also part of the planning commission. Businessmen I have already mentioned were not in any way opposing it. So you are, basically it's only one person who gives a very trenchant critique of it, and that's Milton Friedman. But as I say, actually in the book, that Milton Friedman was yet to be accepted even in his own country. Therefore, there was no chance that Milton Friedman would have any acceptance within the Indian system, actually. And nobody is even aware of what Milton Friedman wrote during that period. It's much later that his the short note that he wrote came to light somewhere in the 1980s. So certainly, there was very much agreement about what Nehru wanted to do. It just simply turns out that it was everybody was wrong in a way.
So, I'll come to this point. Now, you have actually devoted a complete chapter where you dealt with the Fabian socialism, where you said that, Nehru was turning moderate from a staunch socialist, where he was almost a communist, you said, but then he turned more moderate post-independence. Yes. And you said, an evidence for this was open because he was open to changing his views as well. But it did show a very pragmatic. You are trying to. I mean, what are you trying to project? A very pragmatic aspect of Nehru, because he was not against the private sector. He went for some space for that. He allowed growth of, like I said earlier, Tata Steel and others. He seemed to have balanced both. So, but you still would hold socialism pretty much responsible for what has happened.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the accommodation was just accommodation. So I also tracked the history where Nehru began to change his views. So up to 1936, when he's the president of the Congress Party and delivers his presidential address in Lucknow, the radical socialist is very much there. What he says in the speech admires Soviet Union, what they had achieved, and he goes on to say that I see no other way than a very socialist communist kind of government. So roughly, one can check the full quote, but it is very much along radical socialism lines. But then, you come to 1946, and once the Constituent Assembly is appointed and discussions begin to happen there, he's actually pushing back against the hardcore socialists within the Congress Party. So a change happens during this decade. And the change happens.
So here I would like to draw your attention. Nehru also, set up institutions like ICICI, IFCI, IDBI, UTI. Basically, these institutions were there to mop up long-term capital from savings, and then these are given to private sector for their development. So how can this be socialism? In fact, he was tapping the market, isn't it, to take funds and then give it to private sector. He was trying to help them.
No. These were all set up. These were not institutions set up in the private sector. These institutions themselves were set up in the public sector.
So public sector institutions collecting funds, and then they were funding private sector.
No. So obviously, once he had converted, once he realized, again, if you read the book carefully, the book traces that in the National Planning Committee, which had carried out its deliberations from 1938 to 1940, those 2 years he had to confront the Indian industrialists, because 3 or 4 major Indian industrialists were also a part of this National Planning Committee. And there he describes in The Discovery of India that we didn't always agree. And but they also learned from what we had to say, and I also learned from what they had to say. Nehru at that point realized that if he wants to actually industrialize India, there is no way he can do it without the contributions of the Indian industrialists, who were who were a force to reckon with. And industrialists themselves realized that they will not have a free hand themselves. They came to accept the importance or the role of the public sector. So they accepted. And that is how the Bombay Plan actually took shape.
Yeah.
Because then once the industrialists kind of learned during these deliberations from 1938 to 1940 that that Nehru was actually going to use very actively the public sector, they made the accommodation as well and codified that into the Bombay Plan. So both sides actually made the compromise, and this is how the idea of mixed economy took shape. So Nehru ultimately, his deeper objective, of course, was to combat poverty, industrialize India, and grow. And whatever he saw would actually help the production activity. And there are various speeches where he says that production was ultimately the most important, because it was only through more production that we could address India's appalling poverty. And so that is where he accommodates the private sector. Private sector accommodates.
So these examples, Dr. Panagariya,
that doesn't make him in any way a capitalist.
No, I'm not saying capitalist. To be a socialist, a hardcore socialist, is not what he was. He was willing to accommodate. He was changing.
Nobody says nobody says that in practice. Neither does the book say that he was a hardcore socialist. No, the hardcore part, radical socialist part, he left behind. That after 1936 address, his Lucknow address, presidential address, you don't see any evidence actually afterwards, particularly after the 1938 to 1940 deliberations in the National Planning Committee. You don't see any evidence of the radical socialism, but he is socialist because he is expanding the public sector. He is expanding the public sector. That process is actually continued further by his daughter. And by early 1980, more than 3/4 of the paid up capital of India has gone into the public sector. So no capitalist model would say that you put 3/4 of your capital in the public sector. That is socialism.
Yeah. Okay. So the other issue is that's why I refer to public sector units like IDBI and ICICI, the banking institutions, and others, which also came up during those days. So we'll move on from there. See, you have referred to one significant aspect, that if it's very interesting. You have kind of tried to speculate, saying that if it was Sardar Patel, unfortunately, if he hadn't died earlier, I mean, you had tried to do a kind of thing where you referred to it in two places. Perhaps he could have been a better prime minister who would have taken India on a different course. But the evidence seemed to be very thin. What did you base this on?
Yeah. So whatever evidence is available is what I used. So I don't push it any harder. What can be said is what the book says. It's in the last chapter where I come to speculate, and I say that, look, suppose suppose the age trajectories had been reversed, so that Nehru was the older one and Sardar Patel was the younger one, and therefore Nehru had left the scene in December 1950, which is when Sardar Patel passed away. And Sardar Patel had lived till May 1964, which is when Nehru passed away. And so then I try to look into his speeches and all. One thing is very clear, that he is never arguing for socialism. He's never arguing for public sector. On self-sufficiency, I say that it's not clear whether he would have worked towards self-sufficiency or not, because we can't say one or the other way. There is nothing that I found in his speeches or writings on which I could draw a conclusion. So it's a limited conclusion that I draw there. But a very interesting thing which I found out afterwards, by the way, which is an interview with JRD Tata. This is done. This is a journalist, Rajiv Malhotra, who did an interview with Sardar Patel. Rajiv Malhotra used to do these interviews on Doordarshan, and very large number of them he has done with luminaries of all the luminaries of the time. So JRD Tata actually says exactly what I said, what I conclude in chapter 15. And I had not seen that interview till after the book had come out. So this is only within last month or two, I found out about this interview. And there JRD says that Nehru didn't really know much about economic issues. And then he says that suppose, Nehru was the younger, Patel was the younger man and Nehru was the older man, then the situation with respect to economy will be totally different. So JRD now, remember, had known both Patel and Nehru. So that actually certainly corroborates exactly what I speculate in chapter 15 or the last chapter of the book.
Yeah, so here I have a slightly different question. In another place, you also referred to Sonia Gandhi and said that perhaps
Indira Gandhi.
No, Sonia. You said that perhaps if she had known if PV Narasimha Rao. I'm coming to the. I just fast forwarded your book. I'm coming to another chapter where you dealt with Narasimha Rao, post Narasimha Rao.
Yes.
So you said during Narasimha Rao, he did a massive changes. He brought in 1991 liberalization following the forex crisis we faced. So there you said, had Sonia Gandhi known that he is going to make such massive changes, perhaps she would have never allowed him to become PM. You have said that.
That's speculation. That's speculation.
Yeah, again,
I'm speculating.
I'm
speculating based on what we observed from 2004 to 2014.
Okay, thanks. So just leave it aside. So I just want to come back to the issue where according to you, Nehru failed to tackle poverty, which was his objective. And that's why you said why he failed in his two objectives. While he succeeded in his political project, he failed because you said this was his main thing. He couldn't bring down poverty levels. But this is a question I want to ask as an eminent economist. Would you be able to answer this? You see, even after 3 decades of liberalization, which happened in 1991, there are 33 years now. The poverty hasn't completely vanished. I think extreme poverty, as per one estimate, is still up to 12 to 13%. The other estimates actually may say that we still have 1/5 or 1/6 of people living below poverty line. So isn't this 3 decades enough? Didn't we do enough to do that even now?
Look, the book actually does implicitly give you an explanation for it. Although, as far as numbers are concerned, if we are extreme poverty as measured at the Tendulkar line, if you do that, then of course that poverty at the Tendulkar line, which is what we have used all these years, all these decades, then it is below 5%, based on the 22-23 consumer expenditure survey. But that's a low poverty line, and if you want that poverty line ought to be a bit higher, I will grant you, I will not contest the fact that we still have some work to do in combating poverty. But there the book actually provides you an explanation, which is that, not explicitly, but it argues that, look, what happened in those 15 years did not go away. There was inheritance of ideas. There was also inheritance of the industry structure itself. So even today, if you look at it, our most successful industries are largely capital intensive or skilled labor intensive. You got petroleum refining, you got machinery industry, you got pharmaceuticals, you got finance industry, you got IT industry, ITES. These are our successful industries. But how are we doing in the labor-intensive industries? Apparel, footwear, furniture, not very successful. So the industries where you could have created more jobs for the masses, that is, are still not doing very well. And that's very much because
so one
even
indication
though,
is that we're still spending 82 crores. Still 82 crore people are getting free ration, isn't
yes,
it?
well, that I suspect, I mean, that is um, politically, there is
Okay.
some political
Mm.
support for that, and all the chief ministers want to do it. The central government wants to do it. So, I mean, that's questionable whether actually. Certainly, if you could go by the Tendulkar line, you got, Tendulkar line certainly takes into account the need and food needs of the people. And by that measure, certainly our poverty is down to 5% of it or less.
So am I right in concluding? Actually, it is. Are you trying to say it's not required this much of free?
Well, I think less required. I would contest, and I did actually at the time Food Security Act was brought in, that you certainly, 75% of rural population and 50% of the urban population, even then, was the coverage was more than what was required. I mean, they had the numbers, they also had the numbers at the time. Certainly they had 2004-5 poverty numbers. So the coverage was more than, you remember that the some in the administration at the time had started by saying we want 100% coverage. And
Right.
so that was negotiated down to 75 in rural and 50 on the urban. So this was, this was a politically negotiated compromise. So that is where, but you see, coming to your central question of why still the living standards of the masses are still not quite what you would like them to be. And that has to, on that, first of all, we think that 91 we actually ended licensing, investment licensing. We did not, because small scale industries reservation was still continuing. So in all the labor intensive and all the products that are labor intensive were on the small scale industries reservation. That did not end till 2005. So the real kind of ultimately delicensing of investment happened in 2005. On trade side, only the inputs and capital goods were liberalized in 91. The consumer goods were liberalized in 2001. So a lot of this liberalization itself, we think that, 33 years or something, but we were very slow. And there again, the Nehruvian socialism is playing a very key role, because ultimately it is the thinking from Nehru passed on to the next generation, the new politicians learning from the old one, the new bureaucrats learning from the old ones, the new economists learning from the old ones. That process actually, therefore, this inheritance continued. And even till today, how many advocates of free markets or pro-market model among the economists do you see? Not many.
Not many. So here, I think I was particularly, I read through your book in chapter 5 and 6. You have been very, elaborated horrors of licensing and controlling norms.
That's a challenge to the reader.
Yeah, then you have gone to give one example which I kind of relate to. How those days buying a scooter in a black market was more expensive than buying actually a new one from the showroom. So it was like that. But later on somewhere, I mean, you also very heavily castigated bureaucracy. You say that they haven't measured up to what you would have otherwise expected. I mean, they didn't, to the political class, they didn't explain the nuances of what it means to deal with the economy in a different manner. You have said that. So I just want to know, see, bureaucracy, dealing with bureaucracy to cut red tapeism or dealing with it to change the course. Basically, the thing comes more from the political class, isn't it?
It's
So
both.
it would
It's
have been
both.
their, it's their skill which would have molded the bureaucracy the way they wanted. And it's a problem which everybody would be facing all around the world. I'm sure all administration government face this.
Yeah. Look, I'll say it's both. Now, if I had not worked inside the government, then I would have agreed with you that, why blame bureaucracy? It's the political class which has to, which ultimately is responsible. They are the representatives, etc. But now I've seen it from within. Actually, a lot of the things, not everything that a prime minister wants done actually happens.
Oh,
The way the rules have been written, and partly in self-serving way. Continuity is of the bureaucracy, not of the political class. And that continuity gives the
so
bureaucracy a
you are
lot.
saying something very, very interesting. You are saying that even prime minister, even powerful prime minister like Narendra Modi would find it sometime that the bureaucracy doesn't fall in line completely. Is it right?
Well, you see, you never see this, that the bureaucracy is not working towards what the prime minister wants, but it works very slowly. The way to say, the way to do it is, you say, sir, yes, we are doing it,
Yeah.
but the
So
process,
then
no,
that
that's one.
itself becomes a self-professing. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that because the bureaucracy itself sees, that it can be faulted. So as a result, the regulatory barriers are multi-layered. So particularly think about, when you want to privatize an enterprise, it is a very difficult process. The process is why? No, that's also because when Vajpayee tried to privatize, so many allegations came through. So the bureaucracy then has to protect itself. And so
Okay.
therefore it puts a process in place, which is very difficult. So that you say, okay,
True.
look, if we jumped 10 different barriers and then privatized it, then it must be a clean operation. We are not to be blamed because so many in the system actually blessed that particular action. So that
Okay.
is, the multiple layers of regulation that now exist in the Indian system. In anything you want to do, create a natural slowdown of anything that any prime minister wants to get done.
Okay. So I will take you to
Now, just
social
one
sector, which
thing I
I'm
do.
personally. Yeah.
Please allow me
Yeah.
to add this one thing. I just want to be very clear that
Sure.
my criticism of the bureaucracy is that of the central tendency of the bureaucracy. But among the
Okay.
bureaucrats, you always find some incredibly positive, dynamic
Which you have
bureaucrats,
said in the book, you have
yes,
acknowledged that.
which is something, yeah. But I also wanted to bring it out here that, because without some some leaders within the bureaucracy, all the changes that we have been able to do in the last 33 years could not have happened. I mean, whether you take Narasimha Rao's liberalization or you take Atal Bihari Vajpayee's liberalization or Prime Minister Modi's liberalization, there were some bureaucrats who were playing an extremely positive role. They were driving the process in a way from within also. So one has to recognize the existence
Yeah.
of some very forward-looking, far-sighted bureaucrats as well.
So I now take you to social sector, where you said that had the obsession of Nehru with the heavy industry was less, more funds could have been rocketed for health and education.
Yes.
That's what you have said. But you also said one place which is interesting. You have said that perhaps with reference to IITs and IIMs, you're saying that, suggesting at the high end, a small section of the population acquired skill levels comparable to those prevailing in Western economies, but the low end, even basic education failed to arrive. That's your quote exactly. But so therefore, I have two questions. First is, isn't spending on education and health or taking care of that is more of a state subject? For example, southern states seem to have done better. They also started off with a disadvantage. But then over a period of time, they seem to have caught up much quickly. If you look at the outcomes, if you look at various education outcomes, they've been much ahead of the countries in the north. So isn't it more of a state subject? That's one part of the question. The second is, when you say these IITs, are you referring to these IITs and IIMs? But aren't these institutions really built what India is today? And our engineers have gone all over the world, made a name for themselves. The entire ITS industry, the backbone of all that is coming from this. And in the service sector itself, they are the largest earners.
Good. Glad you asked that question. So, the fact that IITs exist and IIMs exist, we think that they exist only because they were started back in the 60s. But, it doesn't have to be that way. If we had not created, it doesn't, if you did not create them in the say 60s, or if it was the 50s, then in the 50s, doesn't mean that later on we would not have created them. And that same thing goes about ISRO and about nuclear research and so forth. There is a bit of a kind of what is called post hoc fallacy in thinking when people say that because it happened then therefore it is because of that. But we could have had a South Korea like development and or China-like development, and then created the IITs and IIMs afterwards as well. We have China's example, by the way, where during the Cultural Revolution, all higher education institutions have been destroyed. When 1980 comes in or late 70s comes in, Deng Xiaoping comes to the fore. There is nothing. In terms of higher education, there is nothing. Today, China is well ahead of India in every field of education, whether it's technical or non-technical, even in social sciences, actually, if you go by the publication records, etc. I've myself actually studied some of this and reported in one of my books. China, which used to be well behind us in the mid-1990s, today stands well ahead of us in every one of these areas. So it doesn't mean that we wouldn't have opened those. What the cost that we paid for having started these and the heavy industry earlier was no training, no skill creation of the masses. So the skill levels of the masses still remain low because in the end, you acquire skills in factory when you work directly on the job. I mean, you can talk to anybody in their professions, whether you talk to even journalists or engineers or whoever. Much of the serious, skill acquisition happens on the job. And since we had no factories, and therefore workers were not working with any of the modern machinery at any stage for several decades, no skill creation actually happened. And so the productivity of your most abundant factor remained very low, and commensurately their wages remained very low. The value addition that they did remained low. So today we still have this divide, that 45% of the workforce remains in agriculture, another 40 to 45% remains in micro and small enterprises, where they still don't have terribly great access to capital, and it's only 8 or 9, maximally you can say 10% of the workforce which is in these large corporations, which are in large factories or service type of corporations, where you have good wages and where you have good productivity. But what about the remaining 90% of the workforce?
Yeah, okay. So the earlier question, the first part of the question where I asked about the involvement of
yes.
states in education and health, isn't their responsibility?
Correct. Now, you see, at the time, Nehru, the economy was really centrally controlled. And as you mentioned, a lot of resource mobilization happened, which was done by the central government. States really hardly had any of those resources at the time. And the process was driven, because heavy industry requires engineers and managers. So we had to invest whatever resources were available for education had to be invested in these institutions. So P.T. Bauer actually gives this dramatic figure that during the second five-year plan, the development expenditure on education was less than the investment done in one steel mill, what was less than half of what was invested in a steel mill. So that is how limited resources were left over. I mean, in the end, resources were limited. So, and it was very centrally driven process, as you would know. Pandit Nehru used to work very closely with the chief ministers, writing to them every month what he thought were the right priorities and so forth. So states were, it is much later that states begin to get more resources. I mean, now, being at the Finance Commission, I realized that, in the early days, states had very limited resources.
Yeah. So there was a final question. I would like to have a final word from you. You have said that the Nehruvian legacy and the long shadow of socialism still continues to, cast its shadow. I mean, you think is it still continuing because there's been a regime change since 2014? There've been a lot of changes which have come. So how optimistic you are that the kind of economy you want to see and the way it is heading to?
So on the economy, I remain very optimistic because, in the last 20 years, we have been able to grow roughly in real rupees, if you do, about close to 7, maybe a little bit below 7. In dollar terms, if I look at it, in real dollars, we have grown about 8%, and in nominal dollars, we have grown about 10%. So there has been a solid breakthrough in growth. So growth will continue. I still think that we need to do a few more reforms. The labor laws, for example, which have been enacted by the parliament in 2019 and 20 need to be notified. That will be something very, very important for, giving fillip to the labor-intensive industries. That is still an outstanding reform which needs to be implemented. Parliament has done it, but but those laws have not been implemented. So that's something I'd like to see happen, which would then help the mass employment to grow a little faster. But as far as growth is concerned, given we have done about 10% already in nominal dollars, with that kind of growth, which I think we can certainly sustain over the next 2 to 3 decades, by 2047, which is what the Prime Minister has been talking about, at 10%, we roughly get to 130 or 31, 32 trillion dollars in current dollars. In today's dollars, maybe it'll be, in today's dollars, it'll still be close to about 20 trillion. So future I see as being very good. I think very difficult parts of the reforms that we needed to do have been largely done. There may be a few more, but we still, for example, privatization of the public sector enterprises is still required. Some privatization of banks also is required. But these are work in progress. I think the government also is well aware of it. So I remain extremely optimistic about the future for sure. And I'm hoping that maybe I'll live another 10 years or so. I'll get to see a $10 trillion economy of India.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Panagariya, for your views on your book and ending it on an optimistic note. Thank you so much.